is Julia Price, and I'm on faculty here at Loyola in the School of Social Work. And on behalf of our dean, Gautam Menon, I just wanted to invite you and welcome you excitedly to this event. As we all know, this topic is extremely important to our city, and we have some of the leaders and thinkers here to share their thoughts with us. To start, I want to just invite the Executive Director of Friends of the Children, a good friend, Tal Hasaklowy, to the podium as the host of this event. For those of you who are familiar with Friends, they're really leading the way in helping us think about relationship-based support and interventions, particularly in the area of mentoring and youth development, and they have so much to teach us. I've been working with them over the last year and a half here in Chicago and been involved in their work nationally over the last many years, and I'm so glad we have this wonderful office here in Chicago to teach us so much about what it means to invest in these young people and families in partnership and collaboration. So on behalf of Loyola, thanks for being here, and welcome, Tal.
I want to thank you all so much for coming out on such a gorgeous day for this really important conversation. Tonight wouldn't be possible without the support of our generous sponsors. First, our presenting sponsor, the Pritzker-Pucker Family Foundation. We're very honored to have Julie Weiland, the Executive Director of the Foundation. I just saw her, Julie, here. Julie, thank you so much for being with us. Julie and the Pritzker-Pucker Foundation were instrumental in bringing Friends of the Children to Chicago and have been phenomenal partners of ours through the process. Thank you for your strong partnership and for understanding our role to help address trauma and reduce violence in some of Chicago's most vulnerable communities. I also like to thank Rush University Medical Center and Loyola University's Graduate School of Social Work for being sponsors of today's event. Too often, when people hear about communities such as Austin and North Lawndale, the first thing that comes to mind are negative connotations. They shake their heads and talk about those people, wondering why can't they be more like us and have some real values? Our intention today is to help reframe that narrative. We want to shift away from fear-mongering and instead focus on strengths and deep human potential. We want to draw attention to conversations that draw attention to the multi-generational disinvestment and chronic marginalization which has taken place over the last several decades. And specifically, we want to bring light to the impact that trauma has, the ongoing effect it has on a person in any community, and it can lead to a host of long-term negative outcomes. Children in communities such as Austin and North Lawndale learn no differently than anybody else. They don't have an innate, inevitable propensity towards violence. Too many people don't realize that that's the reality. Today's discussion is about the reality and impact of trauma and intergenerational trauma, the potential risks associated with it, and the interventions that can make a significant difference to change a child's life trajectory. Friends of the Children is proud to be part of that solution. I'd like to tell you about two children in our program. Brian is about to finish first grade. He has a contagious laugh and is super curious and inquisitive. Brian's mom loves him very much and does her best to provide for him. They both live very difficult lives. Brian's mom was sexually abused as a child, and she dropped out of school in 8th grade to take care of her younger siblings. By the time she was 17, she had 2 children of her own. Over the years, she's had many relationships, many abusive relationships. Brian's dad died last year when he was in kindergarten. Brian loved his dad very, very much, and Brian witnessed his father physically abusing his mother. Since Brian's dad died, he and his mother have lived in 8 different locations, including 3 homeless shelters. When we first met Brian last year, he was full of anger. He acted out with tantrums and fights, both at home and in school. Brian's mom's biggest fear is that he'll get involved in gangs and violence like his father and older siblings. When we enrolled him in the program last year, we learned that his kindergarten teacher kept him in the back of the classroom facing the back wall because she said that he was a maniac and had no desire to learn. She said she had a class of 30 students and she had to focus on teaching kids that were ready to learn the curriculum. She told us that his mom was illiterate, excuse me, and never came to the school. She thought Brian was beyond hope and not worth wasting our time on him. We're very proud to have Brian in our program. Crystal loves drawing and reading, and when she gets comfortable with a person, you get to hear her great sense of humor. We first met Crystal last year when she was in kindergarten. She was doing fine academically, but she was unusually reserved. She wouldn't make eye contact with adults, and she avoided making friends in the classroom. Crystal's mom was homeless when she was pregnant with Crystal and didn't achieve secure housing until Crystal was 5 months old, when they moved in with Crystal's mom's girlfriend. About 4 months ago, Crystal's mom left the house and has only called Crystal a few times since then. For now, Crystal is living with the mom's former girlfriend and the girlfriend's current boyfriend. Crystal's mom, her girlfriend, and her girlfriend's boyfriend all struggle with substance abuse. What Brian, Crystal, and their parents all have in common is they've all been exposed to significant trauma. Trauma in the form of abuse, gang violence, substance abuse, and homelessness. And they all grew up with parents that themselves were struggling with the negative effects of trauma. Crystal and Brian are just two stories of the 56 children and families that we serve. Each one of these children and families has a compelling story of their own. At Friends of the Children, we believe that all of these children have great potential. And we believe that their parents and caregivers love their children very much. And every day we see the high cost that untreated trauma plays out in their day-to-day lives. We're holding this conversation to help us understand and gain compassion for what many families and children endure on a day-to-day basis. And to understand that if we provide proper support early in a child's life, we can provide them with a solid foundation for future success. We're honored to have with us today the acclaimed journalist, professor, and filmmaker, Alex Kotlowitz. Most of you probably know who he is. Alex is the author of 4 books, including There Are No Children Here, which I know has had a profound impact on many people here, including shaping the course of my professional life. He's also one of the producers of the documentary, The Interrupters, and recently released a very important book called An American Summer, Love and Death in Chicago. Alex's ability to create deep, honest relationship with people living in Chicago's South and West Sides, and to beautifully share their story with his reading public, has been instrumental in reframing our understanding of the humanity and complexity of those living in extreme poverty and violence. I'd like to invite Alex to share with us some opening thoughts and reflections. Please join me in welcoming Alex Kotlowitz.
Thanks. Is this working?
I think it's not on.
Lift it up. How about now? Yeah, they're great. First of all, it's an honor to be here amongst people who believe so strongly in maintaining our social compact, because God knows we need more of you these days. Tal just asked me to reflect informally on sort of my experience in writing from distressed neighborhoods in our city and what I've seen vis-a-vis the trauma. And I want to recall just 2 incidents from when I was working on my first book, There Are No Children Here. And the first one is the very first time I went out to visit Lafayette, the older of the 2 boys that I spent 2 years with, who was living in the Henry Horner Homes public housing complex on the west side. And it was my first time in public housing, and I walked into that place, and I think like anybody else who has spent time in public housing was just completely knocked off balance. I was so disturbed and unsettled by the conditions in that place. And I felt this initial sense of shame, like how is it I could not know. But I went to talk to Lafayette. Lafayette was 12 years old at the time, and I remember as we were sitting there, he was this kid who didn't have much affect, didn't have much emotion. And he began to tell me a story of an older boy a week earlier who had been shot in crossfire in a gang war and had stumbled into his high-rise and died on the stairwells outside of his first-floor apartment. And I made 2 mistakes in that moment. One is thinking to myself, he doesn't care, that he's gotten numbed, he's gotten hardened to the violence, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But the other thing to be perfectly frank, is given how flat his affect was, I didn't fully believe all that he was was telling me. And I remember Lafayette must have sensed that, and that he physically grabbed me by the elbow and took me out to the stairwells to show me the bloodstains on the stairs. And for me, this is, I think, the sort of most fundamental and most important thing vis-a-vis kids growing up in neighborhoods that are so physically and spiritually isolated from the rest of us, is that those of us working or spending time in those neighborhoods, we've got to find a way both to listen and to believe. The other story is that while I was in the course of reporting the book, there was a moment when a friend of Lafayette and Farrow's, a 10-year-old boy, Alonzo Campbell, walking on the way to the Boys and Girls Club, was shot in the back of the head. And I'll get back to Alonzo in a minute, but that same week, and many of you may remember this, Lori Dan stormed into the Hubbard Elementary School in Winnetka and shot 7 children, killing one of them, an 8-year-old boy, Nicholas Corwin. And what was so striking was the response of that community to this tragedy. You know, they brought in teams of psychologists and social workers to work with the kids. They brought in psychologists and social workers to counsel the teachers and the parents. The governor called for tighter school security. There were cries for tougher gun control legislation. Well, Alonzo fortunately lived, but nobody counseled or comforted Alonzo. Nobody counseled or comforted his friends Lafayette and Farrow. And in fact, if anything, Lafayette and Farrow were discouraged from talking about that incident out of fear that if they did, they'd somehow be held culpable for the crime. No adult walked into that community and said, I will do what I can to make sure that such an incident doesn't happen again. And for me, that profound silence I have seen over and over and over again. And it's why organizations like yours, like Friends of the Children, is so vitally important. After the Iran Children here came out, I stayed in touch with many of the young people that I wrote about. 2 of the kids, not Lafayette or Farrow, were killed in the subsequent years. And I think the thing that for me has been most unsettling and unnerving is the stubborn persistence of violence in our city. And I should say that as bad as Chicago is, we're not even in the top 10 most violent cities in the country. The numbers are just staggering. You look at the 20 years between 1990 and 2010, we've had 14,033 people killed, another roughly 60,000 people shot and wounded by gunfire. And I was struck after the tragic mass shooting in Newtown, and we saw this again in Parkland, by the response to that shooting. We were asking all the right questions, not the least of which is how does a community and individuals continue to move forward after bearing the burden of such a tragedy. And what was so striking to me, and I think back again on Alonzo Campbell, is that we're not asking those same questions in corners of our country like the west and south sides of Chicago. What I've seen in the young people that I spend time with are the very same kind of post-traumatic stress that we see in veterans returning from combat, kids who have flashbacks, who anger easily, who have trouble sleeping, who self-medicate, smoke a lot of marijuana, all the things you might imagine, though I will point out that one of the things that I feel is that we're just beginning to grapple with, and it's a notable difference, is there's nothing about the post-traumatic stress. You lose a friend one day and you wake up the next morning and you're looking over your shoulder, what might happen next? The other thing for me, working on this recent book, which is a collection of stories of people who've been touched by the violence over the course of one summer, is the utter loneliness that people feel. This great paradox, you live in this grand city and yet feel utterly alone. You feel unable to share your experience out of fear that, one, you won't be believed, that people won't understand, that people will see you as somehow personally flawed. And for many of the people that I write about in this book, it was the very first time they spoke about their touch in violence. I just want to end with 2 quick thoughts. One is, for me as a storyteller, the reason I tell stories, the centripetal force of storytelling, is this notion of empathy, this capacity to imagine yourself as others, to put yourself in someone else's shoes. And so what I would urge people who are spending time in communities like the ones I write about is to give voice to the stories that you hear, to help us, the rest of us, see what you see and hear what you hear. The other thing I think it's really important, and I hope we'll talk about it today in this panel, is I think it's important that in talking about the trauma that we also talk about two, I think, very important things. One is that we're, for the most part, especially when we talk about the street violence, most of the street violence in Chicago and the rest of this country occurs in neighborhoods that are deeply distressed. It speaks to the great inequity in this country and the profound poverty we see in our cities. And so to talk about trauma in our children and not to talk about that inequity would be a terrible mistake. I think the other part of it is also the violence is occurring in cities that are still reeling from the profound legacy of segregation. And so too, I would hope that we would talk about that as well, that these are neighborhoods that are physically and spiritually isolated from the rest of us. So with that, I'm really looking forward to hearing you guys. So thank you.
Thank you. It's now my pleasure to introduce to you all three extraordinary panel experts in the field who I consult with to grapple with these issues regularly. Brian Samuels, at the end, is the Executive Director of Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago. His deep expertise is aimed at the active integration of empirical evidence into public policy decision-making, and the design and execution of direct service programs. He served under President Obama as the Commissioner of the Administration on Children, Youth, and Families at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Brian also served as Chief of Staff for Chicago Public Schools and as the Director of the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services. We're delighted to have you here. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.
Dr. Colleen Cacchetti is an associate professor at Northwestern University's Feinberg School of Medicine and the executive director of the Center for Childhood Resilience at Lurie Children's Hospital of Chicago. She's worked as a clinical psychologist for nearly 3 decades. The Center for Childhood Resilience provides training to school professionals, community agencies, and parents, connecting children with mental health services and identifying evidence-based interventions addressing their mental health needs. Thank you, Colleen. Dr. Maurice Swinney is Chicago Public Schools' first Chief Equity Officer. He's responsible for moving CPS closer to achieving educational equity, which is a moral imperative for the district. In his new role with the district, he will be responsible for examining our policies and programs for inequities and implementing strategies that minimize gaps in resources, staffing, and high-quality academic programming. Prior to this role, Maurice served as the principal of Chicago's Tilden Community Career Academy, and prior to joining CPS, Maurice was a teacher and a school teacher in Louisiana. Sadly, Eddie Bocanegra, the senior director of Ready Chicago, has been called out for something else, and so hopefully he'll be able to show up in the middle. But for right now, I'd like to turn it over to Brian.
Thank you and good evening. We thought we would start the conversation a little bit by doing some background and talking a little bit about how one would define trauma, so we can kind of level set a common understanding. And we've asked Colleen to prepare some remarks to just walk us through the basic elements of trauma and interventions.
Perfect. Great, yeah. So we wanted to be able to make sure we were all using some of the same language. So I just am going to do a quick walkthrough of some sort of common definitions. For those of us that have been working in the field of trauma for the last 25 years or so, it's an exciting time that we are getting to a point where we need to find common definitions because it means that more people are using these words, which is a great thing. But we want to make sure that we're all kind of using them in the same way. So a lot of what we just heard is really this notion of resilience. How
how is it that some kids can come through similar experiences and yet move through them and be able to go on and thrive and have healthy lives? And we want to be thinking about, as we're talking about trauma, how are we as a community, as a city, as a state, all of us as a families, building the capacity of kids to do that. Obviously, our number one job is to provide a protective shield for kids, but if we aren't able to protect them from these things happening, we want to be looking for these opportunities for resilience. So it's really important to remember a couple quick things about resilience as we talk today. One is that resilience is not something you're born with. It's not a dose that you get and you have. It's something that's growing and changing throughout your lifetime. It's something that you can grow from some internal skills, but lots of it comes from your relationship with other people. So when we're talking about resilience, we're talking about how are we starting to build those bonds and connectedness with hopefully parents, but also with all the other adults and people in people's communities. How do we start to build positive experiences? For many of us in this room, school was that place. But for all of our kids, that's not the case. So where are we looking to build those positive experiences so that people can develop and recognize their strengths as we move forward? So when we think about resilience, we're really thinking about promotive factors. What are the ways that we can help young people and then multi-generations of people build those internal resources and supports, but also how are we wrapping them? And so many of us in this room are working in these other spaces where we start to say, how do we help kids and build that social fabric of support? So we really want to be recognizing that resilience is not something that we can sort of say resides in a person. I worry sometimes that we have a message in our country that sort of says you should pull yourself up by your bootstraps. That is not resilience. The ability to bounce back is not an internal measure of me as a person. It's a reflection of me and what I've been through, but also what I bring and who was around me to help me through those experiences and who's willing to step in and help. So I think it's really important that we have that frame. Whoops, I'm moving quicker even than me. All right, so when we talk about trauma, many of you here are part of the Illinois Childhood Trauma Coalition and other groups that have been working on this. I can tell you it took us 3 years at least to come up with this definition, but the good news is it's been adopted by SAMHSA, and it's really one that I think helps us make sense out of this. The first thing is that there is something traumatic that happens. There is an event or a series of events that happens. Those things are not traffic or bad hair days or any of those things that my daughter who's in high school talks about. Those things are really scary moments where you believe that you or someone else that you love is going to be hurt or even killed. We came up with this word event. You know, we think of it as an event as multiple things. For many of our kids, it's not just a one-time event, but it's a chronic exposure. There's no post to the post. There's never an end, and so we really need to think about that. There's also those people who lose folks. That's traumatic grief. So when you lose somebody that you love, there's a normal process of grief. But when that process is interrupted by the traumatic memories of what happened, and the people around you aren't able to help you walk through and move through that grief because they are also so traumatized, that's when we have traumatic grief. So traumatic grief is a more complex form. So those are all various types of individual traumas that people can experience. But the key thing to remember is how we experience that, how it affects us is different for different people. This is why you can be in a family and have one child really impacted by something and another child not. It depends on your developmental stage. It depends on how close you were. It depends on if you blame yourself that you didn't fix it. So experience of that event is really important. And then the final one is effects. All of us who've been through any kind of loss or any scary moment have these moments where you think, you know, I'm never going to get through this. There's a typical kind of healing that's usually 2 months or so on average. It can be longer if it's a loss of somebody important. When we talk about trauma, we're talking about effects that go beyond just that immediate loss of that just immediate person, but they start to shift your sense of the world. You start to feel the world is dangerous, that you can't control things, that everything is out there is not designed to help you be successful. And so what we really want to think about is that trauma has all of these different elements, and it's important that we recognize all of them. Sorry. One of the things to know, and we can certainly talk about this in lots of other ways, but at least 50% of us have experienced at least one trauma. So exposure to trauma is something that many people have. But when we start talking about impact of trauma over time and the kinds of issues that we're struggling with in our city, we're talking about many of those folks who've had multiple traumas. So when you think about who actually gets to a trauma specialist, the National Child Traumatic Stress Network says on average, by the time someone gets to a trauma expert, they've probably had at least 4 traumas. And so those kids have gotten exposed to a lot. When we've done some data polls here in Chicago, we did some looking at some second graders that were referred to a trauma group in our schools. 7, 8-year-olds, they had already had 11 traumatic experiences by the age of 7. So we are talking about pervasive impact. How many of you have heard of the ACEs study? How many of you haven't? It's okay. All right, so we're going to do this really quick. The only thing I'm going to tell you today about the ACEs study is if you are not familiar with it, you're going to go home and you're going to look it up. The main thing to know is that this study profoundly changed how we think about how trauma impacts us. We shift through this study. These were all individuals. There was 15,000 or 18,000 people, and what they did is they did this really simple study. Did any of these things happen to you before the age of 18? And if so, just count them up. And what was so amazing about this was that it was a simple yes and no, and yet it's very profound on its impact. The other thing to know is that while this study was done initially with a very largely middle-class white sample, it has been replicated again and again. And so the key messages on the ACEs study are that lots of people have had at least one trauma. There's more people than you'd imagine have had a lot more than that. And if you've had more than 4 traumas before the age of 18 in these individual ways, I'm not sure who's doing that, then you have some pretty strong and high risks for negative outcomes. So what we know is that these things come together. It's not surprising to think of, if you think of those ACE events, if you're living in a home with substance abuse, very likely that that person would be incarcerated. You might be separated from them. There might be domestic violence. So it doesn't take much to get to an ACE score above 4. But what we know is that if you've had those things, your risk for almost every single outcome, negative outcome, is higher. Everything. The big takeaway from the ACE study is not what we all kind of knew logically, which is if you've had a lot of horrible things happen to you, you might be depressed or anxious. The real takeaway is that you're actually hugely more at risk, and it's, oh geez, this is like such a soft little thing. You're not only just at risk for these negative outcomes that are mental health, we would be expecting that, but the really big takeaway is that you're twice as likely to have all the health issues that cost our country literally billions of dollars. So the most powerful thing about ACEs is knowing that we can look at what's happened to you as a young person, and we can predict your risk of these negative outcomes. And if you want to learn more, there's a lot out there. Just look up Illinois ACE or ACEs. So here's the question, well, why is that? And the key thing here is that we're just going to sort of run this through quickly. It's not that these bad things happen and lead to these horrible outcomes. It's that when you're living in that space and being exposed to it for long periods of time, it starts to change your body. Your body is on high alert. It changes literally your brain pathways. How you make sense of everything around you starts to change. And so if you're in that space of constant alert, school is not going to be a place that's easy for you. It's really hard. You might be irritable. It might have difficulty concentrating. Your teachers might say you're not worth investing in, like we just heard. And you start to have problems, and then you might be leading into some of these peer issues. And once you start dropping out of school, the likelihood that you're going to get into some maladaptive strategies that lead to these negative health outcomes is super high. So it's not a direct link. The reason I can do this work is that it's not that bad things happen and bad outcomes happen. It's a pyramid. But the question is, we're often waiting way too late in the work that we do to help. If we know these things are going on in kids' lives, why aren't we intervening earlier? So that's what a lot of the ACEs model is talking about. The other thing I want to think about is that the ACEs is really about individual experiences that happen in a family, but what we know in our community is that ACEs don't just happen in families, they happen in communities, and we need to broaden that context just a little bit. So when we talk about trauma, or we even talk about violence, we need to remember that every time there's a shooting in this community, it doesn't just impact one person or one family, it impacts all of us. Those of us that are educators, those of us that work in this field, half of us listen to the news in the morning, half of us don't. We don't want to know what's happening in our city because we've got this sense that the world is really dangerous. And so it's not just the child that was injured or the child who did the injuring, but it's everyone else around them. It's the kids who go in and sit in a room with an empty desk or those educators. So we know that the world has created a pretty awful view of Chicago right now. And our kids are growing up in a space that says, I'm not worth anything to anyone. This is a dangerous place. And that also starts to impact them. This is also some data that comes from our friends from the Department of Public Health. Some of them are here. This is really important data and not surprising, but what it sort of allows us to do and think about what Alex was talking about is that the communities where gun violence are happening, it's not just gun violence that's happening there. When we look at all of the opportunities that we need and want for every child in this community, the kids that are living in the 48% low child opportunities are also the ones that are getting that violence. So we are having this equity issue, and we're going to be talking a lot more about that. But we know that you can be just 7 L stops apart and have a completely different life expectancy based on your exposure to trauma and violence and your capacity for all these opportunities. We also know that community trauma is real. It's not just how you feel individually, but it's walking through spaces. Kids talk all the time about, I don't feel safe in the park. My parents won't let me go to the park because it's not safe, it's not clean. People aren't around. People are disconnected. Their parents don't have jobs. So when we talk about trauma, it's all of these different levels. The other thing we want to think about is the historical trauma, the systemic trauma. We're not just talking about, when we talk about child, my little pointer's not working. Oh, there it is. So this here is ACEs, right? So this is what happens to us here, but we're not born into a world where where we're separated. There's this whole other space. There's a social context. There's the historical trauma. It's the things that happened to our families even before we were born. And so the world of science is starting to help us understand that we can actually see genetic changes in babies in utero. That's pretty powerful stuff. But we also can see genetic changes in kids who are getting the kind of treatments that we're talking about. So we have both in this message. There's really scary things that are happening. Whoops, this last one. But this is what we're talking about when we talk about the world of exposure to trauma. It's what's happening in our context, what's moving us ahead, and the question is, how are we going to address not just those individual traumas, but the bigger ones? And then I think it just put this up here. When we talk about this work, what we're often talking about is how do we start to move towards solutions that say not what's wrong with you, but what's happened to you? What is my responsibility as the adult interacting with you right now, whether I'm your mom, your teacher, your Girl Scout leader, or a community member, to help you feel that you are safe, capable, and loved. And if we can do those things and build these types of relationships across every interaction that we're in, we believe that we can really start to change this, but it's going to take some significant effort. So I'm going to stop there.
So Colleen, just a couple questions to follow up on your presentation. So the first one is, I was the child welfare director here in 2003, which seems like life years ago, right? And at that time, we began to talk about trauma in the context of children who were abused and neglected. But we didn't really know, we could define it, but we really didn't know what we should do about it. As you sit here today, have we been able to move beyond defining it, as you just did, and thinking more about doing something about it? What's your sense of, have we moved from thought to action over the last 20 years on this particular issue?
Sorry, we don't want feedback. That's a really good question. I think we have a lot more answers than we did in 2003. I think that we have not invested in funding in long-term ways the solutions that we know are the right ones. So I would say that The conversation is shifting. People are talking about this in ways that I would never have predicted 20 years ago, in terms of sort of the commonality of recognizing that almost every negative thing that happens in our country, people are acknowledging that there was some traumatic tie-in there, and that's a big change. But what I would say is that while we've had lots of discussions about healing and what it takes to heal a person and what it takes to build a safe, stable, nurturing relationship and community, investing in those things we're still a long way from that. But the good news is when we see spaces and places where that's happening, we're starting to see progress. And I think from my perspective, one of those places, and that's how I met Maurice initially, was in schools. Recognizing that the mental health issues and the manifestations of these behavioral things are not something that only sits in the social worker's office or the community partner's office that walks in the door, but actually it's impacting everyone. And so thinking differently about how we educate our educators and our employees to realize that they have to do something different. They can't just say this kid needs help and tag you're in, but they have to actually change their ways of engaging with that student. So I think those are the places where we've seen progress, but we haven't seen the systematic investment in changing those pre-service training environments or in changing the allocations of folks working in these different spaces. But I feel like we at least have language and solutions.
Yeah. So just one other question on just the definition and the context. And this goes to this particular issue around, there was an early period in defining trauma in which there was a particular choice to describe it as interpersonal trauma as a distinction from other more natural events. Can you talk just a little bit about the relational aspect of what you mean by trauma and the consequence of it?
Sure. So I think that the key distinction that many of you probably know and that ties in really closely to this work here is that traumatic things create a biological response that can impact our brain and bodies regardless of what the trauma is. That response is across traumatic experiences. The difference between interpersonal trauma is that when traumatic things are happening to you in the context of relationships, particularly if they're relationships with people whose job it is to protect you, then that kind of trauma has a much longer impact and a different impact. So we might have a physiological arousal if we've been in a house fire or we've been in a tornado. There's lots of things that we need to help our bodies self-regulate and learn, and we can do that. But if the very people in your world that are meant to protect you and to guide you through life are hurting you, then your sense of who you are and what your value is and whether other people can be trusted and whether the world is a safe space is fundamentally shifted. So you have both the biological stress of always being worried, am I going to be safe tonight? Am I going to be fed tonight? Is my mom going to be injured tonight? All of those worries. So you have the physiological response, but then you also have that more sort of psychological impact, which is kind of goes back to those questions. Am I capable of being loved? Am I somebody who there's someone who's going to look out for? Is the world safe? So I think those are the big differences. And I think as we've broadened our definition from back in that day, I think the other space that's really different is adding all of these other variables in terms of realizing that what happens in your home is only part of it. But if you're also walking and living in constant fear in the communities that you're in, then that also puts a strain on even families that are trying to do their best to support families, but everybody's kind of on high alert and no one's able to self-regulate and help people to manage their stress.
So Maurice, we want to transition to a little bit of talking about you and your role in at CPS and the duties or the challenges that come with being the chief equity officer for the district. But I would frame up the first question a little bit from my experience, right? So I was at CPS between 2007 and 2000 and right before 2010. 2010. And during the first 2 years that I was there, we had 55 young people that were enrolled in CPS at the time who were killed in community violence. And there was a growing awareness that the district needed to do something. But we were at that time measuring trauma by the number of young people who were killed. We decided late in that tenure to actually define it broader than just those that were killed. And so we went to the next definition, which just included everybody that was shot. And we went from 55 young people to 555 young people. And so we were trying to have a broader conversation, meaning that the distinction between those that were shot and killed were luck, were fate, was Allah, was there was something other than the violence itself that was explained the ultimate consequence to it. But we weren't in a position at the time to begin to think about, so when these events occur and you've got classmates for whom these things are occurring, we weren't prepared to quite talk about what are the consequences inside the school. What's the impact at a student level in terms of how well they do academically, or how they behave and function in the hallways, in the gymnasium, in all of those other spaces in the school. So as you hear Colleen talk about this definition, as you think about this growing science around trauma, how do you understand it from a school teaching and learning perspective, from a principal's perspective of managing a population, some of whom show up to school having had a pretty decent upbringing, and others bringing with them lots of other challenges? So from a school perspective, how do you get your arms around this issue? How do you understand teaching and learning? How do you understand the impact it has on a student's ability to function?
That's a lot.
Gave you a lot of room.
Yes.
Given that I had one less person here to ask questions to.
I want to center. Just do that. I want to center this conversation in traditional education is built on racist structures, and that there is institutional and structural racism that has caused what young people are experiencing in their communities and within their families. And so racism exists because of racist ideas. And racist ideas were designed to drive people out, keep them out, or not invest in people. And so with that particular lens, as we think about what's happening, what's playing out in schools or in communities, I don't want that to be lost in the sort of equity work that Chicago Public Schools has to do, because I think it's important to center Chicago Public Schools as a micro within a large macro that is Chicago. And Chicago Public Schools is probably one of the largest, if not the largest agency or entity that is responsible for Chicago's youth. But we are also should be interacting with multiple systems, CHA, CTA, CPD, all of these agencies that say we are here to protect and serve and support and advocate for young people. All of these systems have to be interacting in service of our youth. With that being the center of this work, one of the things that I learned as a principal is that it couldn't just be about like helping a kid do well in school and let me just help you have a better day. What I ran into as a principal was that there are multiple things happening in the lives of young people, and their desires for themselves and with how they saw themselves and what they wanted to become were very much present. That they were showing like this strong sense of resilience by showing up despite all of these ACEs and things that they were struggling through, and it was our responsibility to do our best to serve them. And when my team and I started to wrestle with this idea of, we recognized two things. Number one, this wasn't about just social emotional learning. This was a larger health concern. And so we had to make sure that our practices around social emotional learning were not about like this kind of assimilation, this culture where it's like, how do we just help you be good in class so that you can pass our courses so that you can graduate? It was more of, no, we have to disrupt ourselves as the adults who are servicing you, connect with the right people to do this work, and then advocate for resources to transform the school community. And in some ways, we were very successful at that. In some ways, we weren't. But when we as the adults took this sort of learning path for ourselves to say, how do we serve our population differently? That was the flip in the lens that we had to do some like this sort of internal interrogation about what our ideas, thoughts, and beliefs were. And that we were not saying that young people need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. It's that, no, we as a school and a city need to serve them differently. And let me tell you, we had 33% homeless population. Our diverse learner rate was 40%. Like there were policies and systems that were clustering high needs situations, because I don't like to say high needs kids. I don't like to describe kids with so if I course correct while I'm doing that, that's intentional. Like I don't say at-risk students anymore. It's like, no, there were students who had multiple risk factors competing and working against them. So, but when we started to do like this, like we developed this behavioral health team, and that was great, and we saw some transformation. But we as the adults had to take a step back and examine ourselves, and we recognized we were bringing our own ACEs and experiences to the table. So we as the adults took the ACEs survey, and guess what? Maurice found that he had at least 6 to 8 in his own childhood. And the question to myself was like, or now is like, how did you get through that? And what is that learning experience? And so how do we like not look at kids from this deficit perspective of like, oh, you're so pitiful, so poor, we need to help you, to say that, no, you actually come with resilience and desire and assets, and how do we use that to start to mitigate the trauma that you've been experiencing? And so there was this balance of like behavioral health while also really trying to work hard at being intentional about recognizing the brilliance that young people were bringing to the table. I didn't even get to the equity office stuff yet. I think we'll come back.
So let's move to the question of equity officer and the way in which you see that role playing out in the context of the environment that Colleen just described in terms of community and school.
Yeah, so when I first started, I think October 9th was my first day, going up to month 8, I think. Like I had this desire to like just be really audacious in terms of like demands and how I wanted the system to be different. And the more I went to community action teams and LSCs meetings and meeting with everyone like from philanthropists and politicians and different organizations, I realized that we had to build some sort of systems disruption in order to accomplish the things that we wanted to accomplish. And so for me, I had to continue to reframe, like this is not, the equity work in Chicago Public Schools is not just like, how do we increase behavioral health teams in schools, but how do we make sure that students who need us the most get the adequate resources, and how do we implicate all of ourselves as people who work in Chicago Public Schools as actors in this work, so it's not like everyone says that the district needs to do this, and no, to say, no, we are the district. If you take home a paycheck from Chicago Public Schools, you are either complicit in the actions of upholding structural institutional racism that has like hundreds of years old, or you are a systems disruptor. And when we started to like plan for that, it's caused us to move a little bit slower in saying, equity work is everyone's work, and we're all responsible for resource allocation design. We're all responsible for making sure that people feel included, and not making sure that they feel included, but actually making sure they are included. We're all responsible for analyzing our policies and practices. We're all responsible for interrupting the way we think about other people. And as we continue to like build that sort of work out, I think it's going to like position us very well in terms of like how we actually accomplish this work so that we transform the district to get to sustainable change, which will include behavioral health teams and partnering with people who really are about this work in service of young people.
Great. So obviously, we have another panelist that's just joined us. And so, Eddie, the first question I have for you, it kind of moves from those young people who are experiencing trauma to the adults who have also either had experiences that were traumatic, or they are engaged in a lifestyle in which they continue to be at risk for exposure to trauma. And so in your work, as you think about working with mostly those young men and their families, how do you understand the course of their life? And in particular, do many of the adults that you're interacting with have their own childhood stories of trauma?
So I think the best way that I could answer this question, and again, apologies for being late, a couple of things that I had to really manage, which I won't go into details right now, but so when I think about Ready Chicago, I think about the 500 men that are in our program, and these are individuals who are acutely at risk of gun involvement. I think about my own journey in life, where I spent 14 years of my life in prison, and the things that kind of led me to prison. I think about the time that I reflected and what led me sorry for the echoing, but what were the things that led me to prison? And how did I navigate systems, within the gangs, within the penal institution, and then how did I navigate life post-incarceration? And given the work through the ACEs, Bruce Perry's work, thinking about Derek Gomer-Smith, and thinking about the family dynamics around trauma, the best way that I could illustrate this, I think about a young man named Jody in our program. Jody's about mid-20s, 26, 27. He was about 10 years old when his mom came out missing. About 3-4 months later, they found her mom in an alley, dead. And at 10 years old, he had an older brother in his late teens who ended up being the caretaker. They were also being supported by the grandmother, but the grandmother constantly was ill. And it was the older brother, who was, I believe, 19 or so, who was kind of finding ways to support the family. A few years later, Jody had another brother, at the time was about 16, 17, who was also killed. So think about adverse experiences just right there, in that, his mom, being killed at a very young age, older brother, who had to find other forms of bringing an economy to the house, and then having another brother who was killed. So not surprisingly, he turned to substance abuse, challenges and issues there as a way of coping. But even with Ready Chicago, we recognize that jobs and cognitive behavior therapy is one way to addressing these issues. But when you deconstruct and you really peel the onion in terms of what Jody has gone through, you realize there's a lot more in there, right? And that even an 18 or 2-year program, in some cases, is not enough. So what we're ultimately doing is really taking back those 20-plus years of life, of this kind of adversities that he's had gone through, and really find meaningful ways to kind of build upon his resiliency as well. And Jody is one example. There are so many there are like Jody in our program, where many of them are being raised by grandparents or uncles, where their family members have been killed. Last story that I'll just mention, and this is also the power of both trauma, resiliency, and opportunity. A young man recently in our program, Anton, he was shot in the chest. He was with us for about 17, 18 months. And he was, a participant who was really involved in our program, very critical in his thinking. We recognized that there was a lot of other challenges that he had in his life. However, he would constantly come to our program. Long story short, he was shot about a month ago or so. And when we visited his mom, one of the things that his mom left with us was that about a month into the program, her son was actually bringing the entire family into the living room and having a circle conversation. What she didn't know that her son was exhibiting and trying to really duplicate the efforts around CBT. And so sometimes there's this notion that people don't want to heal, right? Or they don't want to seek therapy. At the end of the day, it's really about access, and it's about how culturally competent we're also introducing these kind of tools. And how do we constantly be behind them and encourage them and push them, right? Recognizing that success is not linear, that people with high trauma constantly or frequently have those challenges.
So like Colleen, Eddie mentioned CBT. So when you think about breaking the cycle of trauma, what are the kinds of interventions you think of? What are the kinds of strategies folks are adopting to begin to address more directly the consequences?
CBT, for the non-therapist in the room, is cognitive behavioral therapy. And what I can say about cognitive behavioral therapy is it's basically an attempt to think about how do you manage your emotions by thinking about how you think about what's happened to you, and also changing how you're moving through space, how you're acting. So cognitive behavioral therapy is basically recognizing that our feelings, thoughts, and behaviors are all linked, and that if we can approach how we think about situations and how we move when we're upset, we can actually change our feelings. Because most people don't believe they can change their feelings, but the fact is, they're like, I feel this way, I can't change it. But there's ways that we can help people learn to do that. So when we think about where we're moving in terms of progress, I think a couple things. I think cognitive behavioral therapy is a very powerful tool. I think it's one of the easiest types of mental health for us to actually evaluate. We can teach people to use these strategies at little people can learn this, and old people can learn this. What we find is that it's especially useful in a group setting because people can learn and practice what they're learning all together. So we're seeing a lot of buy-in around cognitive behavioral approaches to trauma in particular. We've got 3 or 4 in the city of Chicago that we've already kind of started to expand and make available in our schools and in our communities. And those are really powerful tools, because one of the most important things it does is it helps kids to recognize that what they're experiencing is all of what I talked about with the ACEs, that they feel like they'll say, I feel crazy, I feel like I can't sleep, is that what's wrong with me? So part of what we do is some psychoeducation around what your body's going through. And then we go through a space where we say, your body's responding in a way that was adaptive. These are all healthy. You got to where you got because your body was doing what it needed to do to protect you, and that's a really important message for kids to hear, and adults. And then we say, but the problem is we need to help you train your body not to respond that way as frequently. So we need to change your ability to acknowledge, to assess the situation and decide, is this a fight or flight situation, or is this a situation where I'm feeling anxious, but I can actually calm myself down and there is safety here and there are safe people. So it's a really important tool. I think what we're learning and what's emerging is that a couple key pieces of that. There's that psychoeducation, that normalization, but then there's also this idea that what happened to me is not something that I can ignore, but it's also not what should define me for the rest of my life. And so when we talk about doing this work well, what we're often talking about doing is helping folks to acknowledge what's happened, to do the listening, that what they are experiencing is real and it was really difficult, but then we also are saying, let's try to figure out if we can talk about that with people instead of keeping it all bottled up, where it's not being talked about, it's not being discussed, and then it blows up in various places. But instead to say, these things have happened, you can talk about them and they can be part of who you are without being everything. So there's that piece is really important. But I think the other piece that we're really seeing emerging science is around if our bodies are on this alert, what do we need to do that's not mediated with language? Because cognitive behavioral therapy is great, but it's very language, so many of us would probably love it. But for our young people, and certainly for some people who that's not their strength, it's also really important to do more of that body-based work. So we're seeing a real rise in some of the alternative things like mindfulness and using repetitive exercise, a lot of the work that Bruce Perry had talked about in terms of neurodevelopment. So I think we're seeing strategies for both emerge, and I think the recognition that we do need to really have people trained to do this and do this well, and that to do it well, it's not just taking a course in graduate school, it's learning to do it and then to bring and get case consultation to talk about how it's impacting us. So it's a lot of levels. We're seeing an emerging science of practice, but we also need to invest, like I mentioned before, in helping the people who are the healers to use those skills, but also be aware of themselves.
So Maurice, in the fall, a principal comes to you and describes behavior that he's seeing in young people that clearly is an indication that at least some of them are struggling with exposure to trauma. What's the advice you give to that principal? Where do they begin their journey in understanding? How do they begin to get their arms around this very real thing for which they're not necessarily trained or necessarily read up on the issue, and they come to you for advice?
The first thing I think I would do is probe their understanding of what that experience was to receive that information. I would be curious to know how that adult, that principal, for example, is thinking about the information that they heard, because that would help me to give some sort of recommendation or pathway to supporting that student. I think it would also be important for me to advocate with the principal if he or she has the clinical staff to do some redirection to deal with the immediacy of whatever that need is, while at the same time examining or building the right system and structure in the school to support that particular student or a cluster of students who might have a similar need. One of the things that I had to learn very early on was, as a principal, I can't solve it all, but I could build a community or a coalition to help to address the diverse needs that young people had. And to really take the time to unpack what the trauma is or was. So we had behavior, we've been with Laurie Children's when I was at Tilden since when I became principal in 2012. So there was a lot of design work that had gone into supporting particular students. And I think I would also just remind the principal and any of us is that our disposition in front of young people matters. Our smiles, our energy, our hellos matter. So we did some zones of regulation work at Tilden, and one of the things that we were practicing was how do we recognize the face of young people to let us know if a child or a student is distressed or not. And what we did in classrooms was, in some classrooms, you could walk in the door and just kind of move your name, if you were red, yellow, green, and put your name in a section. And we knew if you were in the red, that just means you need a moment. We need to not ask you to fill out this thing or do this bell ringer and all of that stuff. You might need a moment. You might need a moment to sit in the hallway. You might need a moment to talk. But how do we provide those sorts of spaces within the classroom or right outside of the classroom to just take a breath and a pause so that a person could also do some self-regulation. So I think they will kind of build a coalition, redirect in some ways, but also keep a positive disposition in front of young people, and then redesign the school to know how to respond to the needs of young people at multiple levels.
So Eddie, you find yourself in a situation where, as you've grown in your own knowledge and you've seen the size and the challenge of the issue, you've built out a program around trying to be very responsive to that. But I would imagine that it's difficult to go from a young man who you meet briefly who describes issues that clearly are related to trauma to referring them to a program. So what does engagement look like? What does that relationship and continuity require before sending them off to a program feels appropriate to you?
That's a great question, and simply because of this. There are amazing models out there nationally, and what tends to happen is that social service providers, government, often believe and feel and think and operate where the client is coming to them. And that's important. However, there is a portion, there's a population in our city, in our own backyards, that we as a society have disconnected from them. It's not them from us. We don't include them in a number of different things. And so what tends to happen, because of the history of their own trauma and going unaddressed, they find ways to maladaptively cope. We see it day in and day out, not only with participants in our program, but even with staff at times. And so one of our core pillars in terms of our objectives in our program is what we call relentless engagement. And what does that really mean as a trained social worker is really meeting people where they're at, and it's taking a strength-based perspective into the work. Like the sense of judgment or the sense like, hey, pick yourself from the bootstraps and so on. Like, listen, I said this in my earlier response, right? I spent 14 years in prison, over 14 years. That's 5,200 days in prison, from 18 to 32. My first time of being exposed to violence was at 6 years old when I saw my mother constantly being beat up. My second exposure to violence was in my school. And the third exposure to violence was in my community by the time I was 12 and 13 when I saw somebody just a few yards away from me shot and killed. So think about the impact that actually does to a brain, right? Now, I mentioned the incarceration part of my life simply because of this. I'm a graduate of UFC. I'm managing a budget of $20 million right now. I travel all over the world, and so on and so on. But all that has been accomplished in the last 10 years, and my progress has not been linear. I still struggle. But I've surrounded myself with amazing people, someone like Alice Kalovas right now, who's a really good friend of mine as well, and I'm able to talk to them about some of the struggles that I have. I have a vehicle in which I could express some of my thinking. And when I think about programs out there, particularly for the adults, like, what does it really look like to treat these young men as if they were our own family? Because if you had a family member who was struggling with substance abuse, if you had a family member who was struggling with mental health, if you had a family member who was homeless, you would go far and beyond in most cases to support that person. So why are we not doing for this particular population who often don't have the families and supports that most of us in this room actually have? And so a part of that for outreach is to really engage them, is that it's okay if somebody tells you to go F yourself, because that's what happens a lot of time. And we shouldn't be surprised by that, because so many people have let them down. And sometimes themselves, they don't see the potential in their own lives. So I think it's important to meet people where they're at, to relentlessly engage them, and to provide avenues and opportunities for them. But most programs are not designed that way. Most funding is not designed that way. And definitely government is not designed that way. So I think it's really important that we think about how do we engage them. I think it's really important, like programs like, for instance, the children. You know, when you think about 60% of the men that we work with have children, how do we also stop the cycle of violence there? And that's critical, but that also takes a lot of coordinating efforts behind that too. And that is part of the relentless engagement too. Like, how do we relentlessly engage with organizations that have a good reputation and mean well to really partner with them to think about a holistic approach of addressing these issues?
So, Tao, I'd like to invite you to come up and join us. And I think, you know, Eddie provides a nice transition to the question I have for you, which is when you begin to think about that youngest age group that is exposed to violence, and beginning to think about what role does mentoring play in addressing those issues. How do you think about the program? How is the program organized and shaped? What's the philosophical grounding under which you tackle this very difficult issue?
Great, thank you. So Friends of the Children intentionally identifies the children facing the greatest risk factors and with the least protective factors in their lives. So we're looking for the students like Brian and Crystal and those kindergartners who already have well more than 6 ACEs when they're in kindergarten, and whose adults in their lives are experiencing significant trauma as well. We start working with the kids in kindergarten. They're in our program until the end of high school, no matter what. There's nothing a child can do in their behavior to get them kicked out of their program. I like to say all teenagers can make really bad decisions, and that's exactly when they need the adults in their lives to stick by them and love them through those challenges. We don't work with volunteer mentors. It's our full-time salary trained staff are the ones that work with the kids, and we call them friends, and you'll see them around the room here. They're sitting in the back. Each friend only works with 8 children, and we spend 4 hours a week individually with each child in school, at home, and in the community. And our main role is to be that positive, consistent relationship in the child's life. So Brian, the child I told you about earlier, he, again, is a boy who's filled with rage and anger. And he's actually an example of someone who we got into therapy, who we thought would benefit from therapy. But most of the kids that we work with just need a positive cheerleader and support in their lives. Again, it's not that their parents or caregivers don't love or care for them, but they're dealing and living these really, really hard lives themselves. So Brian is a quick example. Within 1 week, got in a fight with his mom, got in trouble in school, and again, was facing the back of the classroom, slammed the door and broke his mom's finger in anger on one day, and 5 days later threw a rock and broke a neighbor's car window, which caused over $500 of damage. And mom was furious and said in front of him that she wanted to give up her parental rights. And Felix, his friend that works with him, knew that his role at that point was not to yell at him, which is what mom wanted. He took him out for ice cream and just loved him, to tell him, like, Brian, you're a great kid and I love you. And once we got him calm and made him feel a little more more secure, we can talk about the feelings he was having that led to that negative behavior. But he's much more than that negative behavior that had. So that's the work that we're trying to do. As Maurice said, the schools can't do everything, and we're not talking about the behavior. It's what can we do to help stabilize these kids to deal with their rage and anger and all that they're dealing in their lives, so that we can help them calm down, so we can get them to the place that they can access their cognitive thinking part of their brain and engage in school. And so we're there to work in school, out of school for 12 and a half years, and we have great results with the kids.
So I think on that note, we're going to actually open up the conversation and include the audience. Obviously, in this brief discussion, we've gone from individual children to the stories of adults. We've gone from individual programs to the responses of systems. And so we welcome an opportunity to dialogue with the audience and certainly feel comfortable covering that exact same spectrum. I also think we're going to invite Alex to come back up and join us. And so let him be a part of both responding to what he heard, as well as be a part of answering questions that people might have. So Alex, if you have a couple reactions, we'd love to hear it. And then we're going to invite everybody else to ask questions as you will to anybody here at the table.
I'm going to make it really quick because I know people in the audience have questions. And first of all, the work up here is remarkable. And I think I came away in some ways with more questions than I do comments. So I just want to throw out some questions. You don't need to answer them right now, but maybe as the audience has. So one, Colleen, you talked about how resilience is not organic. And so my question, I wonder whether anybody has looked at soldiers returning from combat, why some soldiers suffer from PTSD and others don't, who have experienced experience the exact same moment in time? Because is it that they have a support system here at home, or is there actually something about their character makeup? So that was one thing that came up that I thought about. I thought, too, that it's important in this conversation about trauma, especially trauma children, that we sort of acknowledge, and this, Maurice, you must think about this a lot, about secondary or vicarious trauma, especially among, I saw that in social workers I spent some time with down at Harper High, and I felt it myself working on the book, and so that's also got to be a concern about those who are sort of working with young people in trauma. I also think that, Maurice, you brought up something really important, which I think is the importance of language, and I'm so glad to hear about. It so bothers me when I hear this. People talk about at-risk youth. It's only one of many examples where I think we tend to reduce people to something, to a lesser part of who they are. And so I think language is really important in talking, especially about youth. And then the other thing is I just wanted to say, too, is I think it's also important in this conversation as we talk about, well, two things as we talk about, especially trauma among kids, is that I just think it's really important, and this probably goes without saying, but if we're going to somehow grapple with the trauma of these kids, we've also need to grapple with their families. I mean, the family is the most fundamental institution there is out there, and we don't, and Brian, you know this better than anybody, it's so hard to know when and how to intervene, but maybe this is one place where we can find a way into families to help sort of fortify them. I mean, it also speaks to why it's so important to fortify communities, because in fortifying communities, we'll fortify families. So anyway, those are my quick thoughts and questions.
Great. So the floor is open, and we'd welcome questions.
Hi, I wanted to ask Mr. Sweeney, can you tell us more about sort of what you've been doing at the Equity Office at CPS in the last year, and I guess how some of those priorities, what you've been doing, relate to the topic at hand here?
I would say what I've been doing first is really doing a lot of analytics work of really understanding Chicago Public Schools, understanding some of those health outcome data pieces that we talked about, understanding, like UIC does this hardship index to really understand the implications of like school transformation, district transformation, but also my role as an advocate for young people in their own communities where there have been systemic divestment in neighborhoods. Another part of that has been building my team. I have a policy strategist, data strategist, and achievement specialist because I wanted to, what I frame as cast the net wide enough to really understand the team. And we've also been experiencing a lot of like equity learning and trainings to develop our own sense of common language so that we can lead for equity in Chicago Public Schools. We had an extensive listening tour of listening to multiple people in multiple places for multiple reasons so that when we develop our equity framework that it's comprehensive and that everyone can see himself or herself in it. We recognize that we have to have three key things that we have to do. Number one, we have to have integrated change across our district so that the district is moving and that the equity office is not a silo of work like we will now do this and everyone else continues to function in the way that they've always functioned, but like what are the implications for equity in talent, communications, finance, education, operations, and how do we think about that systemically? The second thing that we know we have to focus on is how do we develop equity-driven leaders so it's not all of us leading, but like how do we develop this sort of equity lens on the work, particularly around racial equity, health equity, gender identity equity, so that we can understand like the variations in which young people need us to show up and advocate for them for their own needs. And then third, in our CPS 5-year vision, we were very clear, the equity team actually, we did an extensive kind of job in really making sure that the vision was targeted around African American and Latino males, thinking about our Latinx communities, and like how do we take a targeted universalism approach to saying, if we really want to impact our district, where do we start? And we know when we look at the achievement differences, not achievement gap, the achievement differences between multiple student groups, not subgroups, how do we look at the achievement differences across multiple student groups to say, where do we need to focus our attention as a district? Where do we have high concentrations of disinvestment? And where do we need to start that work? And so one of the things that we did in connection with like the budget team is to say, when our school budget rolls out, like we have to make sure that multiple schools are not dropping off a financial cliff. And so we did a $31 to $34 million to say, we know that there are some enrollment shifts, and we have to make sure that young people have the people who are in those schools in front of them. Because one of the experiences that I had as a principal that really left me in tears one year was when you cut positions, you start to cut relationships. And like, how do we kind of stop this sort of cutting of relationships because people matter?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Sure. So we'll just work our way back. So the two of you have your hand up, so please. No? Yes.
Sorry to gush for Mr. Sweeney as well. When I heard the idea of the equity officer, so much came to mind. It's like, oh, what a great idea, right? That's so needed. And I think what came to mind for me was the built on a racist system with these continued racist policies in place. And I see myself benefiting from it, right? I see my kids in a school that continues to get money from the district when we're raising money ourselves as parents, and then these other schools in the other communities which aren't getting those resources. And I'm like, why are we getting more money? Why is that happening? And so I guess my question is do you feel like the district is on board with that? Do you feel like principals from my school are going to be willing to say, sure, we don't need this money, give it to the schools that really need it?
I think, yeah, so I think there is a level of communicating and understanding what has happened over years. I really appreciate the WBEZ article that talked about like the 1950s and 60s and like the $1 billion loss. The Metropolitan Planning Council produced a report that talks about by having segregated schools and communities, the loss of revenue, for example, that should be flowing into our city. I recently looked at a heat map of the Friends of accounts and where they're concentrated across the city and like making meaning so that we can educate people about this sort of like these racist ideas about pulling yourselves up by your bootstraps is a strong belief that people have. And when you think about that Chicago Public Schools is about 10 to 11% white, but the city itself is 1/3 white, it's like, where are the white people, right? And many of them are in private schools in different sectors, and so their minimal interaction with people of color helps to reinforce those sort of racist ideology, whether they realize they're upholding those things or not. I remember when Marissa Navarra was doing a presentation on the Metropolitan Planning Council's work, and she talked about, I wish that she said that, I don't know if she'll still do it now because she has other things on her plate, but she talked about like, how do we think about this sort of like helping white people to understand the cost of segregation, and that we don't have people of color carrying this kind of emotional tax to lift up and do this equity work. So I think it's about educating people and about just drawing a line in the sand over time to say, we have to do these changes in service of the systemic inequities that have predicated for years.
Great, thank you. You had a question? No? Yeah?
I could ask a question. So just thinking about this, that you might have answered this in some way, shape, or form, but as we think about equity for our students, is there also a conversation, or will there be a conversation for our CPS staff? So from teachers to, kind of cafeteria workers across the board, is that a conversation that will happen?
Yes, it was the life I lived as a principal.
Yeah.
It is mentally fatiguing to wear multiple hats. I used to have, I worked with Carla with Mindful Practices, and I had just kind of built in my principal schedule that Mondays were about mitigation and mindfulness. Like, young people are coming to the school in whatever way, shape, or form, and I have to be ready to support them in that work. And there were times that I had to do advocacy work to, keep positions and things. And I appreciate like the work of Liz Kirby at the time, who was the network head of ONS, who would like just help me to save and not have to lose. But that should not be the work that shouldn't be the work of principals. But I will also say that, so with that, a part of the role is advocacy in two ways. Number one, systemic government funding, and number two, partnering with organizations who can support young people in their needs so that the emotional wear and tear is not resting on the adults in terms of how we think about secondary trauma.
So, Maurice, your comments remind me of some work that we're doing at Chapin Hall, where the state of Washington is reorganizing a set of agencies around vulnerable populations. So you've got both early childhood all the way to homeless youth, from child welfare all the way to juvenile rehabilitation, as they describe it. And they had hired Chapin Hall to help review their performance improvement systems across those programs and to really help them build out a structure that made sense. And what they wanted to know most about was, so what should their dashboard look like, right? That's the way of thinking about improving things in public systems. And so, what they were asking us to do was help us build a better dashboard, right? And so we kicked the can down the road on that one by saying, well, let us do a literature review. Let us bring forward to you the strongest indicators you might use to drive performance. And you won't be surprised by this, and I suspect that they won't be either, but $600,000 later, the strongest predictor of performance improvement is the people doing the work. It's not the dashboard. It's knowing who your people are, what they do, what they're capable of, and what they need to be successful. That is the single most significant predictor of improvement for outcomes for kids in all of those vulnerable systems.
This is one of the best Starbucks drinks I've ever had. Was not the drink itself. It was one day I got the drink and it was just good, and I looked at the person who made it, and I said, this is really good, and she says, I put a little love in it. And I was like, whatever that is what is needed to do this sort of work. Like, there are some things that we need to say, you know what, everybody needs to do A, B, C, and D. We need to move resources, we need to invest, we need to do some resource sharing, we need to make sure the right people are at the table. This policy is not working in the best interest. While at the same time, like, how do we get this sort of internal motivation and mechanism built into people through understanding so that we all can like shift this thing together, so that if any of us as actors in this work are not in play, that the work of equity continues to move throughout our district.
So we have time for a couple more questions on this side. Ma'am, you had your hand, and then back the gentleman right there at the end of the row.
This question is for Colleen. You mentioned earlier the biggest change you've seen is more around dialogue, but that investment is still pretty lacking. So if you were helping to dictate where investment would go, like what would that look like in the schools? Would it be lowering social worker caseload? Would it be making sure every school has a behavioral health team? Like where would that be?
Here, come.
Is this one working? No, I just turned it on. This one's live? Sorry, I'm clearly not a technology person. Well, gosh, if I had the power to say where money should go, I think it's all of the above. I think one of the things I forgot to mention earlier when Brian mentioned kind of where are we going with this, I do think some of what Alex said is really critical around as early as possible. So if I could spend money on as much as possible helping those new families that, we hear about these baby boxes in places like Norway. Like, really saying to families that this job of raising kids is really difficult, and we all know that at some level, but nobody really tells you that enough. And I think if we could invest as early as possible in those supports for young families and young children and parents that have been injured and hurt people. So we've got to treat the entire system. And so I think where I'd want to spend as much money as possible is educating a new group of people coming forward into the professions, whether it be healthcare, education, schools, community members, elevating them to really do this kind of simple stuff that's up here. So how do we create those environments where people feel engaged and safe? And it's skill building at the most basic level, and recognizing that we're really looking at how do we invest in the life of a child from when they're born all the way through and build the resources that they need along the way. So it's what is that very first nurse that comes in and meets that mom and baby, are they giving them what they need? Are they supporting them? Are they looking at a broader picture of how to help them do their job and moving forward? Certainly within schools, I think, I can't stand up here and not answer that I would like to have more mental health professionals in the schools. I think we need better allocations. We have way too many people focused on just the general education, just the special education students, and there really isn't a workforce to address all the students that are coming with challenges as early as possible. So we need to elevate the capacity of teachers, but we also do need to bring in and pay for services. So Medicaid reform is a really big piece of this. Paying for things, many of you are in this room as philanthropists that have been paying for mental health services, and that's not your job. Education shouldn't be paying for mental health services. So we need to change how we fund things and put our money into the areas that we prioritize. And I think that goes as early as when babies are born.
So Eddie, let me throw you into the mix here and have you answer the same question. If you woke up tomorrow and you had a pot of money, where would be the obvious places for investment?
So, funny you say that, right? I wake up every morning, I'm like, hey, I got a $20 million budget. What am I going to do with this, right?
So I had a $10 billion budget. That wasn't enough either.
No, I think, honestly, I strongly believe that it's not always about financial resources. And I know there's probably people in this room that are going to disagree with me about that, and that's okay. We could debate that. Financial resources are needed, but that's not the only thing that these communities really need. A lot of our communities need the infrastructure. A lot of our small nonprofits need the backbone support to be able to train, develop their own staff that often comes from the same communities, that often resemble the same clients and participants they're working with. If I was to wake up tomorrow and money was not an option, I would think about how do we really coordinate our efforts? How can Heartland Alliance, as an example, work closely with Tall in the work that she's doing so that the 60% of men that I mentioned just a little while ago that have children, that not only are those who are qualified based on age are eligible for programs like Friends of the Children, but the other families. See, the truth is, if I had a dollar, right, or any investor, there is a lot more research that we have about children and adolescents. That is true. I remember taking a class from Neil Guterman, who used to be the dean at SSA. He's now the dean at New York University. But we know a lot we know more, I should say, about children, particularly from 0 to 5, than we know about 6 and up. And so most investors would say, well, we know enough about that, we should put our money. And I would say, yeah, we should. However, philanthropy, larger investors who have the means to really take risk on their investments are also supporting innovative programs and investments and businesses. So I think while we should continue supporting programs like Friends of the Children, we should think about holistically, how do you support the entire family? Because those 60% of the men that I mentioned a moment ago, like, their children need to be supported, but so are those men, so are their middle-aged siblings, so are parents if they're around, so are the neighbors. And I think, if I think about like North Lawndale, and I'll end by saying this, there was a study that was done a few years ago by the Staines Family Foundation. North Lawndale alone, 37,000 residents. It's one of the communities that has the most support dollars by philanthropy. And the study pretty much points out that with all that money, every person, every citizen, every resident in that community should be touched by programming, but they're not. So to me, the lack of coordination. I also would say that there was a study recently that I heard Arturo Carrillo from St. Anthony Hospital, where he stated, we are in the Gold Coast, right? This is the Gold Coast?
Yeah.
Okay. So per 1,000, residents in the Gold Coast, we have what, 350, 360 plus clinicians. In the west side of Chicago, for every 1,000, we have 1 clinician. So I don't know how to interpret that, right? I mean, grad school taught me a lot. So I think to myself, are the people in the Gold Coast more jacked up than the people in the west side? So I go back to access, and so what I would do is provide more access for these families.
Great. So with that, we have run out of time, and so I'd like to just ask the audience to give the panel here a round of applause. I'm going to hand the mic back to Tao and let her close out the evening.
No, I want to thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to our amazing, wonderful panelists. We could wish we could continue the conversation. We greatly, on the behalf of the board of the directors and the staff and our children and families, we're very grateful that you're all here. Have a wonderful evening. Good night.